Aloha, and welcome to the Spiritually Transformative Experiences Research Panel. I'm Sean Lether, an SAI Advisory Board member and the founder and leader of the SAI affiliated group, Hawaiian Ions. It's an honor to be here with such an amazing panel of researchers. Our first speaker will be Dr. Jeffrey S. Overall. Dr. Jeffrey will share his research covering 13 individuals who have experienced a Kensho spiritual awakening, including themes of dark, night of the soul, prior awakenings, childhood spiritual experiences, constantly seeking something greater, trauma, and the role of the ego. Dr. Jeffrey, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Just get my slides up, and in the process of doing that, I want to express my gratitude for this amazing conference and how much I've enjoyed it. So the title of my research is The Antecedents of Kensho Spiritual Awakenings, and it's a mixed method approach. So the purpose of this research was to understand what are the main themes that occur for individuals that have had Kensho spiritual awakenings. And then I wanted to know, once I've discovered what these themes were, what are the various combinations of them that lead to people having these types of awakenings. So what a Kensho spiritual awakening is it's a Zen term for understanding our true nature. So this really involves, coming to terms with the false I actually is. It's the, almost understanding that the ego or the mind is a really good assistant, but not the right person to be leading the show. It's another word for enlightenment. And with Kensho spiritual experiences, they can be a glimpse that can last, several minutes to several days, or they can actually be a permanent process. So with this particular type of awakening, there's almost this flip of the realization of who we actually are. And we may have been living our life through this false I perspective, and then we just come to this awareness, and then there's just this flip. And I'm using pointers because there's no real good terms to describe what this actually is, but it really just feels like it's just this flip, and then you have this epiphany, this aha type moment of who you actually are. And it's just this awareness that has always been present, and there's no real beginning end to it. So the modality that was used for these individuals that I interviewed, it's called the self-inquiry dyad, and it's used in what they're called their enlightenment intensive retreats. So they typically last 3 days or 7 days, and they start at 6 o'clock in the morning and they go until about 11 o'clock at night. And what it involves is sitting across from another person for 40 minutes, and individuals take turns answering an imperative, which involves the imperative of tell me who you are. And through this process, the individual just reflects and reports everything that's coming up for them while they're gazing into the eyes of another person. And there's such interesting spiritual phenomena that can occur when we're just gazing through the eye of another person. And through this process, over several days, people can have these types of enlightening experiences. And from the research that I've done, usually 30% of the people that have participated in one of these retreats have what is called a Kensho spiritual awakening. So what I did is I interviewed 13 people that had one of these spiritual awakenings at a retreat center here in Canada, where I'm broadcasting from. And I did a semi-structured interview process that lasted about 60 minutes. And then this was through Zoom, and the interviews were later transcribed. And I used a methodology called grounded theory. So when I had all of these 13 transcripts, every line in the transcript, I put a code, or my research assistant put a code, and it just really talks about what's being discussed in this particular section of the interview. So through the entire process of doing this grounded theory, we had over 1,000 of these codes. And then I did a descriptive analysis of them to try to get a sense of what are the most important themes that emerged. And what I found was Dark Night of the Soul was a very important theme, and everyone that had one of these Kensho spiritual awakenings had experienced a dark night of the soul, which would involve like these peak moments of suffering, like real rock bottom, these moments of everything, seemingly falling away in their life, very challenging times. Nearly 85 to 90% of the people had experienced prior spiritual awakenings in their lives. They could have been, to varying degrees, small or very significant, like Kundalini awakenings. Close to 75 to 80% of the people experienced mystical experiences or spiritual type phenomena in their childhood. The other theme that occurred was this constant seeking, and they were looking for, spiritual teachers or modalities or different things that were outside of themselves. And the interesting thing that occurred through their journey was that there was a shift where they started to look more within. There was this seeking that was looking within themselves. There was also trauma that occurred in a lot of the interviews. People spoke about, big T trauma as well as little t traumas that they experienced throughout their life. And then also there was the role of the ego that presented. And some of this was related to self-sabotage type tendencies. And what I intuitively gathered through the research was that there was an interesting play that occurred between the dark night of the soul and the role of the ego. And it was almost like at a subconscious level, like definitely below the level of awareness, there was something that was occurring that would stimulate these dark night of the soul experiences to try to wake the individual up. And then the knowledge of these themes is I conducted the second part of my study, and I did what's called a qualitative comparative analysis. So what this really is when we're doing interviews, you get really rich data, but the problem with it is it's not very generalizable. Whereas when you're doing a large scale quantitative study and you're, surveying hundreds of people, that's a little bit more robust, or it gives the researcher a little bit more confidence in generalizing the findings. With a qualitative comparative analysis, this is somewhere in between, where you can do a quantitative analysis with a very low sample size. So that's what I did here. So qualitative comparative analysis uses Boolean algebra, and the philosophical underpinning of it is that various combinations of phenomena will lead to a particular outcome. So through that, I found that the most important combinations that led to individuals having these Kensho spiritual awakenings, and this happened with 11 of the 13 people, was that the childhood spiritual experiences, or these mystical experiences that occurred in childhood, which would look like having extrasensory perceptions that come online at a very early age, before later on in life where maybe the child is speaking to the adults about it and they might not understand. And what I found is that a lot of the people that had these childhood mystical experiences, they turned them off basically early on in life because they felt that there was some shaming that was occurring. The other thing was just this prior awakenings that was occurring for them throughout their lives. And intuitively, and I do a lot of my research just relying on my own intuition. And through the interviews of these 13 individuals, it really started to stand out for me that these people were working in what I'll call the healing arts, or they were at service. Some of them were, spiritual practitioners that were providing various types of services to community and individuals. And I found that this was also a catalyst to helping people have these types of spiritual awakenings. So circling back to the dark night of the soul, just for a second, is that what I noticed from my experiences, and I've had dark nights of the soul, that our mind or the ego structure finds these times and these moments extremely challenging. And I heard an interesting quote at one particular point of my dark nights of the soul, and it was from a movie, and it said that life will bring you to your knees. And it happens to all of us. And it's just go a little bit further and you'll find love. That's what I've noticed with people that have these dark nights of the soul, is that we might not have full conscious awareness, but whatever it is, it's going to be beautiful and it's going to be beyond our wildest dreams. So I just wanted to share that. And the main contribution of this particular research is finding, or at least providing, a preliminary model for Kensho spiritual awakenings. So it can be helpful to individuals that are running retreats, for example, to get a real good sense of what are some of the things to help people to, be pointed into the right direction, gives particular teachings that will be helpful to hopefully increase the number of 30% to maybe something a little bit higher. And it's really just a step towards developing a theory of awakening. And my theory of this, childhood spiritual experiences and prior awakenings is that my view is, we incarnate into this particular incarnation. And if, we signed a contract prior to entering this particular incarnation, and that we are set to have an awakening in this particular incarnation, it feels like the childhood spiritual experiences and the prior awakenings is almost like a ceremony throughout our life that allows this purification process to occur throughout our life as we get towards these types of awakenings, and then after those awakenings continue to purify the process of awakening. And that is my presentation on my research. I'm finishing a couple of minutes early, and I just want to, really reiterate that, the times in our spiritual journey, as we heard throughout this beautiful ceremony, and I've been in attendance in every one of the sessions, and the theme that really jumped out is that we will encounter these ebbs and flows in our lives, and they always lead to something more beautiful and spectacular later on. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Jeffrey. That was such a enlightening and also validating presentation, especially what you were saying about the dark night of the soul. I really enjoyed that. Okay, up next, we have Valerie Varan. Valerie will share how the latest science validates spiritually transformative experiences and the challenging after effects that often follow them. Welcome, Valerie.
I am so delighted to be here. So I've been a lifelong spiritual experiencer myself, and at the 4th grade, I had my first apport. By the 6th grade, I had my first spiritual download after basically contemplating atoms, and that eventually led me to the quantum science you're going to see me talk about today. But how prevalent are our spiritual experiences? According to the latest Pew report that came out end of 2023, 30 to 55% of us are having these experiences, and yet a lot of people are getting harmed by Western psychology. So it's a good start that biofield science came about starting around 1992, definitely helping us see that there's a complex organizing energy field around our biological body. And it's definitely helping us find a way to understand how energy medicine works. I definitely recommend Shamini Jain's book, who really gives us a nice update. But to understand consciousness, I feel like we need to get to a multidisciplinary perspective, which isn't easy for our scientific ways of doing things nowadays. But for me, you're going to notice I've divided the research into 5 categories. We have the research into psychoneuroimmunology and various things that are related to our biology and electromagnetic fields. In the second paragraph, you're going to see a lot of the research related to our very subjective experiences. And of course, that's what we're used to here with STEs and NDEs and what have you. The next category is a lot about mind, and mind matter research. And I especially love that our direct intention has been shown to affect living things, non-living things, random event generators. It can be imprinted in intention host devices, and it can even change the physics of the space, according to Stanford's William Tiller, material scientist, who basically said he suspects we're taking it to a higher SU2 gauge symmetry space rather than this U1. The next category is where time and space is altered from classical physics. So we have the research about precognition, about past lives like Ian Stevenson's research. We have how remote viewers are able to tap into future targets, and so they're looking at retrocausation. And then lastly, we're looking at quantum physics, quantum biology, and quantum information science. So these mind, and mind matter non-local interactions have definitely been demonstrated scientifically. By 2017, Charles Tart said, you know what, telepathy, psychokinesis, psychic healing, precognition, clairvoyance, and remote viewing, they're the big 5. We have so much research on that, like why do we even have to research it anymore? And in the next category, the near-death, after-death communication, out-of-body experiences, mediumship, and reincarnation, he definitely said we have got a lot of evidence growing. I love when Dean Radin says from Institute of Noetic Sciences that he's even getting 5 sigma results, and he would get a Nobel if he actually weren't studying psi. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what is quantum, because as we start to change our, basically our theories, we're going to have to understand quantum. So when we use the word quantum responsibly, we're using it in 2 ways. We're talking about a quantum of energy. If you were to drop water on a calm pond, those concentric rings that you see are because of energy coming in these discrete quanta. And we talk about it when we're looking at quantum properties. So you're going to hear very common phrases that you're going to want to at least know what it's about. Particle wave duality, non-locality, entanglement, superposition. So for example, on non-locality, in classical physics, electromagnetic effects wane with distance. So when we started seeing effects that were not waning with distance and were happening regardless, we started talking about non-locality. And that was what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. On the other hand, entanglement, let's say 2 particles, what they noticed was if 2 particles became entangled, what was affecting one was affecting the other simultaneously. Now, superposition of quantum states is that they found that these particles seem to be existing in multiple states at once. They are measuring them through these probabilistic wave functions and looking at quantum probability amplitudes. So then they say that there's this collapse of the wave function. So it's called the observer effect. Somehow, when they started to measure, whether it's a role of consciousness, some want to say, some don't, but measurement at least, it goes from heads and tails to heads or tails. After they measure, it's a particular location. So when we're looking at quantum, which all our experiencers can relate to, we're talking about we're all one collective whole interconnected system. So if you want to look to some quantum physics theories to really understand reality and consciousness, there's many theories out there. But I want to point out there's two camps. There is that camp that is the shut up and calculate. We really can't apply this to anything real. We can't talk about nature. But we do have the camp of quantum theorists out there that say, yes, we can, and it does represent nature. Lee Smolin, who's into quantum gravity, is one of those. So from an overview perspective, where is the consciousness research now? Well, there's lots of inventories happening to measure our subjective experiencers. There's specific psi experiments to measure our psi skills, the mind-matter experiments we were talking about. Most theories are still consciousness-based theories, neurocorrelates of consciousness, but the leading edge is taking us to the quantum and information. And in last weekend's 2024 Institute of Noetic Sciences, they said that the one that's going to get the prize is going to be reviewing and comparing theories of non-local consciousness. And I'm actually going to see if I can hide this. Okay. So at the Neuroscience Needs a Revolution to Understand Consciousness symposium that was recently in August, Pavo was noticing the bias towards the mechanistic view. He was pointing out the Seth and Bain article of 2022, which looked at 22 different theories and ultimately theories of consciousness and ultimately divided them into 4 categories. But he noted that they were selected only if they were either neurobiological or potentially expressible in neurobiological terms. Now, he did note that the electromagnetic field theory made it, which talks about information being encoded in the brain's global electromagnetic field. And he also noticed that Stuart Hameroff and Sir Roger Penrose's orchestrated objective reduction, OR theory, did make it. Probably because it did, that theory does talk about quantum computations within the microtubules of the neurons. It also gives a role for entanglement, retrocausation, even a role for gravity, leading to a proto-conscious moment, which I'll explain in a moment. Pavo went on to say we should look at David Bohm's holographic theory, that the implicate order is embedded in an explicit order. It does bring in quantum theory and relativity. Christoph Simon talked about entanglement and how photons are perhaps ideal information carriers for sensing quantum information at a distance. But out of the 35 presentations, 25 of them were definitely addressing quantum mechanics. Anirban Bhattacharya, you're going to see at these conferences routinely. He's the one that confirmed that he did find quantum oscillations within the microtubules, and he has concluded consciousness is definitely not local, which of course experiencers know. But I love how when he interconnected 12 brains on his human subjects, I know he's tasked with developing an artificial brain, but he connected 12 human brains. And he said, you know, when one would taste something, when one would smell something, when one would touch something, all the brains were reacting. Other quantum and information-related theories include Dr. Edgar Mitchell, of course, the founder of IONS. He has a quantum hologram theory that involves entanglement and non-local information being stored in the zero-point field. It's in this greater reality. There's a volume 1 and 2. His group is the group that has been doing that. Of course, that was before he passed. But also mentioned in these volumes are an interdimensional realities model, a virtual experience model that I think you'll be interested in. Many contributors that experiencers are going to recognize their names, like Raymond Moody and Bruce Grayson and Jeffrey Long. And Sharon has a great article as well, where in part 1 and part 2, she definitely gives third-person evidence and first-person evidence. It's a great synopsis article. So in the Beyond UFOs book, which the Edgar Mitchell's Foundation, they did that one before the Greater Reality. Essentially, the team said, look, whether we're studying, whether our experiences involve angels or spiritual beings or extraterrestrials or unidentified aerial phenomenon, there's something in common happening here. We're going to say it's contact with non-human intelligences, and it's all consciousness-based communication that's happening. So we really need to start studying it collectively. Doug Maskey, more recently, is someone I've been talking to. He is a quantum engineer, and he was having lots of conversations with William Tiller, the Stanford material scientist. And as a result of those conversations, the book Deep Reality is out. And essentially, Doug talks about what it actually is fundamental, is a proto-bit or information part of physics. And it's structured to lead to the quantum states, which then ultimately gives rise to space-time. So there is a quantum mind. And basically, our thoughts are informational quantum things. Our emotional meaning is what structures thoughts. And there's a space-like and entangled nature to our thoughts. The brain itself is a quantum transceiver and even acts like a random event generator or psychokinesis kind of device. Now, Doug let me borrow this slide just to give you a visual here, but at the very bottom is where proto-consciousness and proto-physics, proto-bit physics would lie. It's beyond space and time. But you're going to notice that it gives rise to these words like quantum foam that you're going to hear. It gives rise to energy and matter, ultimately at the Planck scale, then the quantum realm and the classical realm. So what's happening now in experiencer prevalence data? Two main things. There's a uniqueness of individual experiences that's being captured. Basically, Alani Wabe would like us to know it's like a unique fingerprint. And we're also trying to capture across multiple modalities of experience through Sean Esbjorn Hargan at California Institute of Human Sciences. He's just started a program of integral noetic sciences, and this super experiencer project, he wants to capture really the wide spectrum of experiences. So where are we headed? Basically, we have to kind of move beyond neurocorrelates more into quantum and non-local information kind of models to understand reality and consciousness. And we really need this before the mainstream is even going to look at the multidisciplinary data that's out there. We also need to move towards a more integrative quantum psychotherapy. Last weekend at the 2024 IONS conference, Emma Bragdon, I think I saw she's here today, but she mentioned how Brazil for over 60 years has had these psychiatric hospitals, this conventional and complementary integrative approaches, and it involves laying on of hands. They even do spirit release, disobsession therapy, intercessory prayer. And so notice we're going to need these non-local models of consciousness to even begin to evaluate these programs, much less really bring these programs to the US. So thank you so much. I am so grateful to be here. I will stop my share.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Wow. A lot of wonderful information that you brought to us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have Dr. Jana Elizabeth Colli. Dr. Jana Elizabeth Colli is a transpersonal psychologist or psychotherapist who has provided support for spiritual emergencies for over 20 years. She will be discussing when spiritual awakening becomes spiritual emergency. Welcome, Dr. Janet.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Sean. And I want to thank everybody for being here. I think being here collectively and energetically is really, really significant. So thank you. So I want to mention that when we say transpersonal, I mean the heart of psychology. I don't mean a splinter branch. Transpersonal psychology unites the psychology of spiritual experience and altered states or non-ordinary states, and clinical psychology as well. So it represents very well our evolutionary potential. Okay. So my own spiritual emergency was initiated by cancer. I was diagnosed with cancer when I was 30, and my diagnosis was Hodgkin's lymphoma. If you know Anita Morjani's story, we're very similar. This is my chest x-ray. I had a large tumor in my mediastinum. And in spite of that, I went 3 years without medical treatment. So I was very, very close to death at the end of 3 years. And why is the question? Why did I do that? Well, I had had an early childhood medical trauma. I was hospitalized for food poisoning and various other traumas throughout my life. It made it such that I believed that doing medical treatment was tantamount to death itself. So my point to bring up here is that spiritual emergencies often harken back to past traumas that are not fully processed. Thankfully, my healing was sparked by a dream. A dream intruded. It was very simple. There was a swimming pool and a bulletin board. And the bulletin board announced that Janet Colli would be facilitating encounters between dolphins and cancer patients. Now, I recognize dolphins as embodied bliss, beyond ego, beyond the egoic fear that I was feeling, and that cancer cells are immature cells, non-referent to the whole. So I believe that if I could mediate between the two, that I could surely survive the medical treatment. So that gave me the faith to do it. I did the medical treatment. I had a miraculous recovery, and that ushered in my path of spiritualizing Western medicine. Now, I want to go back to our historical roots. And this book, as I was going through my spiritual emergency, I'd never heard of anything like it. And this came out in 1987. Kundalini, Psychosis or Transcendence. Note how it is framed. And this is one of the first books to come out to deal with anything like spiritual emergency. Now we know other names like Dark Night of the Souls, Spiritually Transformative Experiences. But when we ask what are some of the antecedents or what might spark a spiritual emergency, this slide was taken. Assist published a list of many different catalysts, and there were about 100. So it made for a pretty messy slide. And I just, I'm coming with this. And I want to remind us that I'm looking at things, the catalysts that are personal or even collective trauma right now, illness, crisis, frightening or distressing experiences. So I'm highlighting the traumatic aspects or difficulties that may spark spiritual emergency. So again, not every spiritually transformative experience is or becomes spiritual emergency. So what are some of the identifying features? I like transformational crisis also as another phrase. Number one is the intensity or possibly the longevity, the intensity of these experiences. So you're not often able to function normally. Your activities of daily living can be disrupted, and your egoic identity, of course, is challenged, as was mine, even under the threat of death. And of course, the third one, the higher order spiritual process, though, begins to manifest. back to our historical roots, this book was published by Stanislav and Christina Groff, and this is 1990. Please note the flames. And I want to say about this, that Christina's Kundalini awakening and her past life traumas were vital formulations, okay, were vital to the formulation of the concept of spiritual emergency, and certainly later her bout with alcoholism. But her beautifully written memoir in 2014, The Eggshell Landing, revealed that she had been sexually abused throughout her early childhood and adolescence. So it's very important to highlight the antecedent traumas. And I will say that her experience with sexual abuse really formed her prodigious capacity for altered states and dissociation. We'll come back to that in a minute. And here is my symbolic representation of spiritual emergency. You have a building that represents the individual or now the collective psyche as we go into some collective spiritual emergency. And then there are the spiritual saves. There could easily be 100 or more of those. I have put Asclepios, who was worshipped throughout the Greek Isles, and he did dream work and worked with snakes and rituals, and whose symbol, the physician's staff wrapped around with snakes, is the caduceus, or the modern medicine symbol today. And Shri Ma I will bring up in a minute as well. And so this slide, I hearken back to Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery, 1992. It was a seminal work in trauma research. She looked at the aftermath of violence, from domestic violence to political terror. And what she's saying is trauma serves as a powerful activator of our capacity for trance. Remember Christina Groff. And altered states. So it fosters the development of our ability to have altered states. And Jeffrey Kripal's quote, of course, extreme illness, car wreck, and sexual abuse are particularly effective inducers of the mystical. Jeffrey Kripal is at Rice University. Now, meta skills. Meta skills are the higher order perspective or attitude that we bring to the process. And this is our organizing principle. I believe, for working with anything like spiritual emergency or difficult symptoms. So in essence, these symptoms and spiritual emergencies are radical efforts to simplify functioning, process material, and heal. So symptoms represent a potential movement towards wholeness. And Shri Ma has said that she's a Bengali saint who now lives in Napa Valley. She has said that the essence of spirituality is efficiency. Okay. Now, one more. Okay. Arnie Mandel, your biggest symptom is your greatest dream trying to break through. Arnie was one of the pioneers of transpersonal psychology. And the anxiety, looking at anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, Kierkegaard. I want to also bring up Bonnie Greenwell, who worked with Kundalini, and she invited us to interpret anxiety as energy. Substitute curiosity for fear, and you will navigate these experiences more easily. So why I bring up anxiety, panic, we are going through a death process generally with spiritual emergency, and that is bound to bring up anxiety. Now, this is my colorful cake of life. All the different kinds of antecedents over to the left that for each slice of that cake. And I draw your attention to Joni Mitchell, whose spiritual emergency began really in early childhood. She had a host of illnesses that nearly killed her, and polio when she was 9. They flew her by hospital to a hospital where she could be treated, and it was extremely painful treatments in those days, and she was months without her family. But she recognized later that polio germinated an inner life, a sense of the mystic in her, and she said definitely it was mystical to come back from that illness. Now, later as an adult, she had what I call an echo. So she moved into spiritual emergency again, and she went to the Canadian backbush to be alone. She was really down, and she lived without electricity as much as she could. And when she came out of it, because she had a template for healing, remember, with the polio. And so when she came out of it, she said Western psychology might call it a nervous breakdown, but in certain cultures, they call it a shamanic conversion. So thank you, Joni. And this slide, each line represents somebody's process with spiritual emergency. The first topic in the line is generally what they initially presented with. But then during the course of the work with spiritual emergency, these are the various issues that came up to be processed. So you can see here perinatal experiences. I've had infancy come up, and early childhood and past life. So there's many different issues that for each person may come up during the course of processing a spiritual emergency. And this second line, the psychedelic assisted therapy leading to childhood sexual abuse, the memory of that surfaced during psychedelic assisted therapy. The memory was activated, and then truly she was off and running. Spiritual emergency emerged, and many of this may involve complex trauma. And finally, I know. Each one of those lines, almost every one of them has written their own story. And I would like to compile these into a book, and it would be The Dark Face of Heaven, Volume 2. So that's that was earlier published, and this would be The Dark Face of Heaven, Spiritual Emergency. Let's see, and finally, how can I help? I envision a 3-legged stool. So for the first line of support, you need psychospiritual support because there may be traumas that need to be further processed. So you need some, generally some kind of trauma therapy may be involved. In the second line, the physiological support, so often neglected. I think this is a vital adjunct. Functional medicine is very good with this, and they look at things like diet. You may not want to be a vegetarian or a vegan. They look at supplements and even genetic testing. Now, genetic testing, I just want to say quickly, there is not a gene for bipolar, but there are genetic markers that we want to look at, and the genetic markers may indicate help is needed with inflammation, detoxification, and methylation. So, some people have mentioned so far working with Western medicine and medication. Well, most serotonin is made in the gut. So we want to really look at gut disruption and how to treat that and balance that and provide gut support. And finally, the community support. Each one of those organizations offers support groups. I should add, I will now add, Mary, okay, with the last presentation had a wonderful organization for that. And finally, the Hearing Voices Network, on the final line, when the Groffs originally delineated, that's a good word, delineated the concept of spiritual emergency. They thought that hearing negative voices and experiencing paranoia might indicate that psychiatric care and the medical model were indicated, and that it might rule out spiritual emergency. But actually now, given the Hearing Voices paradigm and the Hearing Voices network, we can work with that. And of course, it depends on the clinician's willingness, but the Maastricht interviews can help people that hear negative voices and experience paranoia to understand their experiences and to identify coping skills. So let me see if I ended early.
Nope, you're right on time.
All right, good.
You did it. Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. To many of us who've had spiritual emergencies, I had no idea what it was when I was going through it, but I love everything that you've shared, and especially validating the trauma and the abuse and illness that many people go through to have these experiences. So thank you very much. Now we will go to our next speaker, Dr. Anne Berger-Knorr. Dr. Anne Berger-Knorr experienced a profound and spontaneous mystical experience. In her presentation, she is going to share her research into transpersonal psychology, making the case that spiritual transformative experiences are normal, natural, and often innately healing. Welcome, Dr. Anne.
Hi, thank you for that introduction. It's great to be here. My presentation today is entitled Understanding Consciousness, Transcending the Boundaries of Reality as We Know It. I selected this title because I believe it best captures my understanding of my experience and my research to date about my experience. In October of 2020, I experienced a profound mystical experience. It was the result of listening to music during meditation, and it was the first time I ever meditated. At the time, I thought it was spontaneous, but as I've done more research, I recognized that it was a little bit more intentional because I was undergoing some trauma, and also I was in a meditative mode, so it wasn't truly spontaneous. But it was spontaneous to me because I had no idea what happened to me. So I experienced this mystical experience where I was visited by several of my deceased family members. I also felt as though I had been visited by God. The encounter was the result of listening to music during meditation. And for many months afterwards, I experienced what I have now come to understand, expanded states of consciousness. It has taken me years to integrate and understand what happened to me. Today, I believe the unity consciousness or the oneness with God that I felt was a state of pure consciousness of the self, the universal self, or the divine self, if you will, within the unified quantum field. To this day, I refer to my experience as the most beautiful experience of my life, even though I had many challenging encounters. So when my mystical experience occurred, I had absolutely no idea what happened to me. And obviously, I asked a whole bunch of questions. What just happened to me? What do you call these experiences? Why do they happen? How do you explain them? What exactly is consciousness? For what purpose do these experiences serve? And what now? Where to go from here? So I turned to the literature. I looked in a lot of different areas. I looked at transpersonal psychology, religious and spiritual traditions, meditative practices, the brain and neuroscience, and even quantum physics. So what do you call these experiences? I found out very soon that there are lots of names for these experiences, and my experience most closely aligned with that of a mystical experience. Comparative studies on mystical experiences point to the following characteristics: ecstatic unity, transcendence of time and space, paradoxicality, sense of the numinous, realness, and ineffability. I can check all of these boxes. I also learned in my research that there are many subtypes of experiences. Yaden and Newberg point to different types of spiritual experiences listed there, 9 of them. I experienced 5 in my meditative experience. There are different types of mystical experiences, 2 broad categories. I experienced both of them. And also, Groff points to spiritual emergencies, which we've heard quite a bit about. And he lists 11 types. I experienced 4 of them highlighted there. I also learned in my research that there are similarities across these experiences. Here I share the similarities across spiritual awakenings, exceptional human experiences, and the mystical path. I was shocked in my research to learn that there were similar stages across each of these types of spiritual experiences. And I have followed the stages of the mystical path to a T. I pray that I am on the path to a unitive life. Why do these experiences happen? Again, I looked in multiple places. Taylor, from a transpersonal psychology perspective, points to a lot of different reasons as to what can trigger these experiences. Yaden and Newberg in the neurosciences also point to very similar types of reasons for why these experiences happen. How do you explain these experiences? Most perspectives explain them in terms of consciousness. They point to states of consciousness beyond our normal everyday waking consciousness. Transpersonal psychology looks at higher states of consciousness, or that's what they call them. Religious and spiritual traditions look at higher or greater power. Meditative practices point to pure consciousness. And the neurosciences point to altered states of consciousness. I list here some of the most important people who have written about these experiences from a transpersonal perspective and who have helped me on my journey of healing. William James, the father of psychology. Evelyn Underhill, of course, she's notorious for her stages of the mystical path. Carl Jung, who coined the terms collective unconscious, archetypes, and individuation. He's important here because he believed that mystical experiences were experiences of the collective unconscious and archetypes. And the term individuation, the integration of the conscious and the unconscious levels, I think essentially is the mystical experience. There is some individuals who suggest that Carl Jung actually uses a lot of code words throughout his writings so as not to undermine his, in the field of psychology, to not undermine his work in psychology. Abraham Maslow, also known as the father of psychology, or I'm sorry, the co-founder of transpersonal psychology, most known for self-actualization, which he thought was the highest basic need that we needed. He went on to write about self-transcendence. And he also talked about peak and plateau experiences, which are higher states of consciousness. Stanislav Grof, who we've heard a little bit about here already, talked about spiritual emergence, which is the innate and natural process as a person individual or as an individual person moves through wholeness and personal growth. Of course, spiritual emergency, on the other hand, is an intensification or a speeding up of this process, which can often become terrifying. Ken Wilber and Jenny Wade, I've looked at their research quite a bit because they're noteworthy in the sense that they look at spirituality in terms of evolutionary terms, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. I share this slide here on Vedic psychology and transcendental meditation because it's very pertinent to my experience. Vedic psychology points to, points to 7 states of consciousness, 4 higher states listed here. The 4th state, and most people only experience the first 3. The 4th state, transcendental consciousness or soul consciousness, is it's not an altered state per se, but it's a distinct state with its own characteristics. And the individuals argue that this state of the fourth state can actually stabilize into a stage. This state, according to them, however, is very rare to access. And the quote or the statistic that I read was that less than 0.1% actually experience it. Nevertheless, and this is important, according to TM theory, the process of transcending to a least excited state during transcendental meditation can unfreeze the development by expanding awareness and normalizing the nervous system from deep-rooted stresses that block further growth. Thus, the hypothesis is that regular practice in transcendental meditation can accelerate the rate of higher states of consciousness and may give rise to stable higher stages of development. And this today is probably my best explanation for what happened to me at an accelerated pace. During my meditation on the night of my experience, I know I experienced all four of these higher states of consciousness. And I know it was this experience that set me on the path for healing and growth and unconditional love. For months, I functioned in different realms. And over the course of months, I continued to experience additional transcendent experiences. My best guess is that this experience was meant to push me, or is continuously pushing me, to another stage of development or another level within a stage of development, which makes sense, right? Because that's the purpose of the spiritual path, isn't it? To develop more deeply spirituality. And my life has changed drastically on account of it. So for what purpose do these experiences serve? Religious and spiritual traditions point to a oneness or a union with God. Meditative perspectives point to transcendence and pure consciousness. Transpersonal psychology points to healing, growth, maturation of the psyche, and also evolution in human development and evolution in consciousness, which is where I now turn. So according to Ken Wilber, there are all sorts of different states of consciousness. For example, there are meditative states, there are altered states, there are peak experiences, and we all have access to these. States of consciousness are temporary, they come and go. Stages of consciousness, however, are permanent. According to Wilber, anyone can experience any of these states. This does not mean, however, that one advances to a different stage of development. States must be stabilized in order to become stages. My theory is, if an experience has been transformative and life-changing for an individual, it's quite possible that that individual has advanced to a new stage of development, or maybe a new level within a stage of development. So, what are the stages and levels of human development and consciousness, you might ask? Here is a self-made chart comparing Wilber's levels of development, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Wade's levels of consciousness, and Vedic psychology. If you look in the blue column, Wilber refers to three broad stages of human development: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional, with an ultimate level of human and spiritual development, that of being the ultimate, non-dual, and absolute. He argues there, highlighted in the yellow, that 90% of the Western population is at the pre-conventional and conventional levels. Thus, a post-conventional level is rare for the most part. He also points out that most developmental stage models at the conventional stage, most developmental models stop at the conventional stage, and that there's very little conversation or recognition of transcendental experiences, which Maslow is one exception to that. This lack of acknowledgement by development models does not mean, however, that transcendent experiences are not taking place, as most of us already know they're happening. But according to Wilber, we're meant to grow spiritually by transcending the ego and returning home to God or the divine or the absolute, if you will. Wade, in the red column here, offers a developmental model of consciousness which recognizes higher levels of consciousness, much like Vedic psychology. I like her model because she explains levels in a way that makes sense to me. Essentially, you can line up her levels with Maslow, as you see here in the red. She points out that individuals begin to transcend the ego or egoic thinking, often in the authentic consciousness stage, that it's not uncommon for transcendent events to appear, much like Maslow's peakers and self-transcenders. Now, you don't have to like Wade's model. You don't have to agree with it. But let's just assume for a moment that her levels of consciousness are true or accurate. A quick look at her levels gives you an idea of where we are collectively and where we could be headed from a developmental or an evolutionary standpoint. Notice, according to Wilber, 90% of us would be in the yellow. But if we transcend to a higher level of consciousness, it puts us in the green. Notice the characteristics: transcending the ego to grasp the absolute, great compassion for all forms, the desire to be one with the ground of all being, or God. Which brings me full circle back to Maslow. Maslow distinguished between self-actualizers, who were peakers, and those who were non-peakers. Peakers were those who experienced transcendence. And look at the characteristics. Transcenders, peak and plateau experiences become the most important things in their lives. They embrace the language of being. They see the sacredness in all things. They tend to be meta-motivated. They're more apt to be religious or spiritual. They're responsive to beauty, and they're more holistic about the world. They transcend competitiveness. They transcend the ego, and they tend to be more loving, more saintly, and godlike. So, what does all this mean? I end with a lot more questions than I do in terms of answers. And here are my questions. What if these experiences are, in fact, innate, biological, and developmental in nature? What if we are meant to evolve to a higher stage of consciousness or existence, both at an individual and collective level? Might higher stages of consciousness help to explain why spiritual experiences are so transformational and life-changing for people who have experienced them? And what might a world of higher consciousness look like if we collectively were to become more loving, compassionate, humble, forgiving, saintly, and godlike?
Thank you. That's wonderful, wonderful talk. If you could put your questions in the chat, whoever has questions, and we're going to go ahead and kind of start with a few. We're going to start off for Dr. Jeffrey first. Dr. Jeffrey, you talked about the dark night of the soul. Do you find that even after a Kensho spiritual awakening that people have dark nights of the soul and that they may go in and out of them? Or what is your research on that?
So what I've noticed is that from the research is with people that have a Kensho spiritual awakening, it's usually a 13-year process that occurs afterwards, and there's a purification that happens along that process, and people will continue to have these dark nights of the soul, mainly because the egocentric worldview or the mind becomes I would say the driver, or that it's the driving force. And then when that occurs, there's more instances of attachment, suffering, and that tends to cause these cycles of the dark night of the soul to continue to carry forward. And then over time, they tend to diminish in strength, hopefully, as the strength of the mind starts to, or the ego structure starts to fall away in that process.
Thank you.
I think I could add to that too.
Sure. Who's that?
Valerie.
There you go. Sure.
One of the things I noticed is when I had my first dark night, St. John of the Cross is who I ended up finding, although 16th century prose isn't the easiest read. But I noticed he distinguished between dark night, little d, little n, and dark night, capital D, capital N. And he said, the first dark night, little d, little n, is what we have when we're earlier on in our spiritual transformation. It's as if in some languages, we might say we've gone from the lower chakras and we're moving to the higher chakras, except for what's happening is we've turned away from that which used to please us in the first through third chakra kind of way, but we haven't yet turned and found our higher chakras. So we're in this really depression, anxiety stage. So no wonder in transpersonal psychology, and I'm a licensed professional therapist myself, so no wonder we see people who are getting anxieties and depressions and what have you, but it's because they've turned from the mainstream culture and they haven't quite yet found the next thing. The dark night, capital D, capital N, St. John of the Cross would like to say, if you've had one, consider yourself blessed. It actually means you are quite a ways along your spiritual journey, which of course, in my experiences, seems to happen over many lifetimes. And so that is the one where he said, you've experienced the divine, you've experienced your oneness, and now it's gone. So I remember that happened to me when I went to grad school, and all of a sudden I couldn't feel it anymore. And the short answer would be, it's as if we had on training wheels and the training wheels were taken away, and it's like, all right, you need to be doing this now. So hopefully that's helpful to the questioner.
Yeah, thank you. To our other two panelists, would either of you like to weigh in on that? And if not, we have more questions, but if you, okay, Anne, would you like to?
So I could share, in my research on Ken Wilber, he shares something very similar, that there are actually three dark nights. There's the dark night of the senses, and the dark night of the soul, and then the dark night of the self. And he aligns those with the three realms of the gross and the subtle and the causal. And so dark night of the senses at the gross level is really sort of your depression, anxiety, before you hit the big dark night of the soul, which is really at the subtle level. It's very, ego-based and can be very, very traumatic. But Valerie, like you said, when you come out of that, right? So it's you sort of the worst is behind you. And then there's the dark night of the senses at the dark night of the self at the causal level, which I think is sort of I think it's where you reunite with God, with the divine, and you alter your ego in a sense that you realize that you are way beyond your ego. Like the union with God is what you need to let the ego go and just let yourself be.
Thank you. Janet, would you like to share something about that? No? Okay, well then let's go to a different question for you, Janet. Do you have any idea what percentages of people who have spiritual emergencies are the result of childhood trauma or major illness? Is there any like statistical studies on that, like the percentages?
You know, I'm not the one for percentages. However, what this does remind me of is Ken Ring's the Omega Project, and I think that was in the 90s when he published that. But what they found when they looked at experiencers of near death and experiencers of what he called UFOs. So he looked at two different populations and gave them a quite extensive questionnaire. And what he found was that there was a significant amount of them that had some form of childhood trauma. And so you're looking at near-death experiencers and experiencers of UFO or alien encounters, otherworldly beings. And so I always thought that was very interesting. But I'm not too much one for the overall statistics, but I do remember that study.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up. I was actually just speaking about that yesterday. He calls us experience prone.
Yes, exactly. That's it.
And for whatever reason, because children have experienced so much trauma, they seem to be more open to these experiences. So
this is in a positive way. It can be what he called psychological absorption, the quality that you become open to things in the environment that others in conventional reality may not be. So again, altered states, non-ordinary states, you're going to be more open. It's not at all necessarily pathological, but it is an opening. I mean, of course, I'm a clinician, and so it comes up a lot that I'm finding this, but the correlation is significantly statistically statistically significant.
yeah, and thank you for making that point that it's not pathological.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, let's go to Valerie, can you tell us in your research, have you found that science and spirit is finally coming together? And what is the most encouraging research that you found?
I think that's what's so exciting for me, because as an experiencer, I went through all these similar stages, right? Where we're first, like I grew up in the Christian tradition. And so then you're like reading all of that, and then you're going beyond that, and then you're going to all these other, and then you're looking at all the transpersonal and the spiritual literatures and what have you. But ultimately, if someone, is going to keep calling you crazy, I was like, well, what theories of consciousness do we have to go? So really, I feel that quantum science, when I really started learning about that and the implications, and also realizing that there are the group of researchers that say, yes, we can apply that to nature. It was so exciting because you could just see it coming together, like all of our spiritual experiences, right? We have alterations in time and space, and we're feeling different levels of energies and vibrations and different things. And we have all this language. And of course, I was seeking to use the language properly. I was like, was there any correlation to that in the heavy duty science? So when it really went quantum, and now that it's really going quantum information, I would say it is so hopeful, because it has never been dovetailing so well as it is starting to come today. And so on one hand, sure, if we're going to be most conservative, we can say, all right, well, right now they're talking about particles, being entangled, let's say, but realize if we too are made of photons, we too are made of electrons, and they've actually found entanglement in all these different aspects of who we are. They've found entanglement in the quarks, in the gluons. So it's so exciting to realize. And after Anirban found quantum oscillations in the microtubules within the neurons, it's so exciting to just see that despite the warm environment, that's the common criticism, but despite that, it essentially, we've got entanglement and non-locality woven throughout. And so from here on out, the research to me is just going to get increasingly exciting.
Thank you. And Anne, would you mind finishing? I'm sorry that I had to cut you off at the end, but could you finish the questions that you were asking? And I think you were talking about the purpose of spiritual awakening.
Yeah, I think I was finished with my questions. I mean, my last position was just essentially that I think we need to move in the direction of transcendence. And I think these experiences are innate. I think they're evolutionary. And unfortunately, we're not talking about them beyond conferences such as this. But I will make a comment about the dark night of the soul and childhood trauma. So I think one of the things that really triggered for me was the death of my sister. It was the anniversary of her death. She had been dead for like 35 years. And when I sat down to meditate, I actually had the intention of reaching out to her. And she came, she visited with me, as did my parents as well. So, and the interesting thing about trauma is, I spent a lot of time re-experiencing her death, but I also knew during the dark night of the soul that I was processing trauma that I didn't even know I had. And I think it's past life trauma. And, it was kind of interesting because I felt like I was processing trauma for people in my family, but then also trauma that, like I said, I had no idea that I had. But my mom had a lot of trauma, childhood trauma, with the death of her father and death of her cousin. So I kind of feel like I was processing not only my own trauma, but for other people as well. It's a really bizarre experience. And, you think you're going crazy because you can't, nobody can really speak to it. At least that was my finding. Like, what is this?
Yes. Well, I could keep asking you all questions all night, but it is time for us to end this section. And I'm going to, again, just thank you all. Your research is invaluable to us experiencers. You give us so much validation. That's the best word that I can think of, to hear somebody else telling us you're not crazy, what you're experiencing is real. So I want to thank every one of you.